We can turn in your Bible to Deuteronomy chapter 12, and we'll be starting with verse 15 tonight. Deuteronomy 12, verse 15. And in your syllabus, it's page 83. Okay, verse 15 says, "Notwithstanding, thou mayest kill and eat flesh in all thy gates, whatsoever thy soul lusteth after, according to the blessing of the Lord thy God, which he hath given thee. The unclean and the clean may eat thereof, as of the roebuck and as of the hart." Now here's a text that people could really twist to try to make it say something that it doesn't say. But first of all, during their wandering in the wilderness and up until the time that they were to enter Canaan, meat eating was not allowed. I mean, there were a couple of occasions where they clamored, and so God gave them meat, and they suffered some serious consequences. But at this point, he's reading their heart, and he sees that they're not going to be happy as vegetarians. And so he says, okay, now that you're going into Canaan, you can eat meat. You'll pay the price for it, but you can eat meat. And up until this time, the only meat that they could eat was in connection with the sanctuary service. But now they could eat it at home if they so chose. Now, he, of course, didn't command them to eat meat. He was just giving them permission because he knew they would want it. And this word lust basically means whatever your heart desires. And some people are going to say, well, then God is giving permission to eat pork and to eat all these other kinds of meat. No, there is no evidence that he did that. But he's just saying, if you're lusting after meat, and he mentions two of them, and they're both clean, you know, the roebuck and the hart. And so we cannot take one part of the Bible and make it say something different than another part of the Bible. Has to always agree. So he's giving permission for the clean meat here. And over in Leviticus 17, verses 3 and 4, it says it this way: "What man soever there be of the house of Israel that killeth an ox, or lamb, or goat," notice they're all clean animals, "in the camp, or that killeth it out of the camp, and bringeth it not unto the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, to offer an offering unto the Lord before the tabernacle of the Lord, blood shall be imputed unto that man. He hath shed blood, and that man shall be cut off from among his people." Yes?
Yes, but verse 15 of Deuteronomy 13 says, "The unclean and the clean may eat thereof."
Okay.
That confuses me a little bit.
Yeah, well, the clean and unclean is talking about ceremonial uncleanness or cleanness. You see, for instance, a woman had her period. She was unclean for a certain period of time. If you touched a dead body, you were unclean for a certain period. And you couldn't go to the sanctuary, basically. But he's saying, you can still eat the meat at home even though you're unclean. And of course the clean can eat it too, because there would be no restriction on them. So it's the ceremonial cleanness or uncleanness that this is referring to, not clean or unclean meat. That's not the issue here. Now notice this one in Leviticus. This is what existed before they went in Canaan. You kill an animal for the purpose of eating that animal, and you're kicked out. You're not to do that at all. And so this provision given in Leviticus 17, 3 and 4, is being removed in Deuteronomy 12, 15 and onward. It's being removed. I put a note here about unclean may eat refers to ceremonial uncleanness, since the animal eaten was not a sacrificial animal. Now, you might wonder why would God even tell them they could eat meat? In Ezekiel 20, verses 24 and 5, it says, because they had not executed my judgments, but had despised my judgments, and had polluted my Sabbaths, and their eyes were after their fathers' idols. So all that disobedience, then God said, wherefore I gave them also statutes that were not good, and judgments whereby they should not live. So he said, I told them they could do what they wanted to do, because they wanted to do it so bad. I told them that. And that is probably one of the principles of the Old Testament especially that trips people up. But if a person is looking to do what God wants them to do, the evidence is plenty clear in the Old Testament. Number one, the best diet is the vegetarian diet, and meat eating is not the way to go. That's very clear if we look carefully at certain points in the Old Testament.
I wonder if they had continued on with the vegetarian diet, if their lifespan might have increased like it had decreased after the flood when they started eating meat.
Well, it probably would have increased some, because as I look, for instance, at especially people that have been in self-supporting work a long time and they've followed a vegan diet and so on, that most of them live well into their 80s or 90s. Whereas if you look at people in general, that's not true. They don't. And I think if we were perfectly obedient to all of the health laws, which even, my biggest weakness was overworking. And so I don't know how much that'll end up shortening my life. But if we were faithful, I believe that each generation would get stronger, and be better off. But it's very few will do it, even for one generation, let alone several generations.
Well, because of their sin and perverseness and their wickedness, God purposely shortened their life by giving them meat to eat.
That's right.
So that was part of his purpose, was to cut short
Yes.
the long lives of wickedness that were
That's right.
taking place before the flood.
In Ministry of Healing, page 311 and 12, it explains this pretty well. The restriction to a non-flesh diet was never heartily accepted. They always felt abused and deprived, and so they didn't really like it. It continued to be the cause of discontent and murmuring, open or secret, and it was not made permanent. God said to them, you really want to eat meat, so I'll tell you, you can eat it. You will learn by experience it wasn't a good choice, but I will let you eat it. That's basically what he did. By departing from the plan divinely appointed for their diet, the Israelites suffered great loss. They desired a flesh diet, and they reaped its results. Well, what kind of results did they get? They did not reach God's ideal of character. So meat eating stops people from making the character growth that they need to make and could make. They did not reach God's ideal of character or fulfill his purpose. As we look at all of the disobedience, we've got some in our Sabbath school lesson for this week. You know, Nehemiah leaves for just a little while. Maybe it was even a few years. I don't know how long that was that he was away. But when he comes back, they're breaking the Sabbath. They're buying and selling on the Sabbath. They're not paying their tithe. It's a mess. And more than people realize, that disobedience comes from meat eating and various other things, you see. So they reaped its results. They did not reach God's ideal of character or fulfill his purpose. The Lord gave them their request, but sent leanness into their soul. That's from Psalm 106:15. So the psalmist comments on this. He gave them what they wanted, gave them their request, but they suffered a lack of spirituality and lack of Christian growth. Now the next text is one that all meat eaters practically overlook. Verse 16, yes.
What comes to my mind is that it's interesting that they didn't have all the pollution and other things that we have today, and they still had that, so we have extra.
You're right. Verse 16 says, only ye shall not eat the blood. Ye shall pour it upon the earth as water. And if you just skip down to verse 23, he hits it again. Only be sure that thou eat not the blood, for the blood is the life, and thou mayest not eat the life with the flesh. Thou shalt not eat it, thou shalt pour it upon the earth as water. So, while he gave them the seeming right to eat meat if they were determined to do it, he never gave them permission to eat the blood. And that is neglected a great deal. We're going to trace this a little bit because this existed from the very beginning when God first said they could eat meat after the flood. Let's go to Genesis 9, verses 3 and 4. Genesis 9, verses 3 and 4. God said, every moving thing that liveth shall be meat or food for you. Even as the green herb have I given you all things. Now remember, the background of this is, if they ate the unclean animals, the species would cease to exist. The only ones they could eat were clean ones because they'd taken 7 of those. But of the unclean, they only took 2. But flesh with the life thereof, in other words, the blood, which is the blood thereof, shall you not eat. So right at the beginning, when he allowed meat eating to come in to shorten their life, he said, you better not eat the blood. That is not permissible. So what we're reading in Deuteronomy is simply a continuation of that same principle. Then there's another one found in Leviticus chapter 3, verses 16 and 17. It says, all the fat is the Lord's. It shall be a perpetual statute for your generations throughout all your dwellings, that ye eat neither fat nor blood. So meat eating has been allowed because of the hardness of their hearts, but never to eat the fat and never to eat the blood. And Ministry of Healing says, of the meats permitted, the eating of the fat and the blood was strictly forbidden. Only such animals could be used for food as were in good condition. No creature that was torn, that had died of itself, or from which the blood had not been carefully drained, could be used as food. Now, here we have a problem with the meat packing industry because they don't follow these rules. And if a person doesn't have their own animals that they slaughter, you can be sure that they're breaking some of these rules. And of course, they don't carefully drain the blood from the animal. Now today, we have what's called kosher meat. The Jews have become extremely careful, especially some of them. And they even pound the meat and, try to get every little thing out. God didn't say they had to do that. But there was a certain way to kill the animal and to have the blood drain out as much as was possible. And then, of course, they had to cut out the fat as well in order to eat the meat. Another comment in Sons and Daughters, page 225. The Israelites were forbidden to eat the fat or the blood. This law not only related to beasts for sacrifice, but to all cattle which were used for food. This law was to impress upon them the important fact that if there had been no sin, there would have been no shedding of blood. So this was tied to the plan of salvation. They were to remember, if it wasn't for sin, Jesus wouldn't have to come and die. And because he's going to come and die and shed his blood, then we must not eat the blood at all. The blood of the Son of God was symbolized by the blood of the slain victim, and God would have clear and definite ideas preserved between the sacred and the common. Blood was sacred. Notice that's an interesting way of putting it. The blood was sacred. They were never to eat that. They could eat the meat itself, but not the blood. Inasmuch as through the shedding of the blood of the Son of God alone could there be atonement for sin. So this was had a very spiritual significance why they were to never partake of the blood. And the fat, I don't think I put this in here, but the fat represented sin. And so they were not to partake of the fat either. Plus, it wasn't healthy to eat that anyway. Now, this carries over into the New Testament. In Acts 15, verses 28 and 9, in case someone wants to say, well, that was an Old Testament rule and it's no longer in effect, we find this. It seemed good to the Holy Ghost and to us to lay upon you no greater burden than these necessary things. And it gives the list for the early Christian church, the Gentiles especially, that ye abstain from meats offered to idols. Now the reason for that was that they had been, worshiping those idols, and if they were to eat meat that was offered to idols, it was in danger of pulling them back in. There's nothing morally wrong, just because it was offered to an idol. But it was a dangerous thing for the Gentiles to do. Second thing, and from blood and from things strangled. So the last two apply to this Old Testament requirement that they were not to eat animals that have been strangled. Why? Because it keeps the blood in. And they were to not eat the blood. So this principle goes all the way through. Any meat eater that thinks that the Bible gives them permission to eat meat must realize that the Bible never gave permission to eat the blood or the fat. Acts of the Apostles 191, the Gentiles were accustomed to eat the flesh of animals that had been strangled, while the Jews had been divinely instructed that when beasts were killed for food, particular care was to be taken that the blood should flow from the body, otherwise the meat would not be regarded as wholesome. Now, another thing that we learn, by study is that all of the poisons in the body are traveling in the bloodstream. And so when the blood is kept in the meat, people are getting very unhealthy parts. And it's bad enough to eat the meat, but to have that is even worse.
I suppose hormones are circulated through there, even more so today with the artificial hormones.
Yes, it's true. And the animal generally knows they're going to get killed, and they are, they're at their top level of their hormones and everything going into their bloodstream. God had given these injunctions to the Jews for the purpose of preserving their health. The Jews regarded it as sinful to use blood as an article of diet. They held that the blood was the life, and that the shedding of blood was in consequence of sin. The Gentiles, on the contrary, practiced catching the blood that flowed from the sacrificial victim and using it in the preparation of food. So God said, you don't have to follow all the ceremonial laws. You don't have to keep the feast days, and you don't have to do all these things. But this is something you have to do if you want to call yourself a Christian. Acts of the Apostles 195. The Gentile converts, however, were to give up the customs that were inconsistent with the principles of Christianity. Now, this principle that we just read from Acts is very little understood. People want to appeal to their traditions that they have been used to doing, to their customs, to their, traditions that have been in that culture or that group of people. And God says, when you become a Christian, you have to compare your traditions and your customs with what God has said. And if He has said don't do that, you have to change your customs and your traditions, because they're not acceptable if they are conflicting with Christian principles. Therefore, things like rock music and other types of music that are not as bad as rock, they conflict with Christian principles. And we must give up that kind of music and learn good music instead, and find out what is in harmony with Christianity. And a lot of other issues, not just that one. The apostles and elders therefore agreed to instruct the Gentiles by letter to abstain from meats offered to idols, from fornication, that was in a different verse, from things strangled, and from blood. Well, no, I guess it was in there, did I? Yeah. So these are things that they were doing as Gentiles, and didn't really, think too much about it. But when they became Christian, they were supposed to give those up. Well, let's read on. It continues this train of thought for a little while. Verse 17, thou mayest not eat within thy gates the tithe of thy corn, or of thy wine, or of thy oil, or the firstlings of thy herds, or of thy flock, nor any of thy vows which thou vowest, nor thy freewill offerings, or heave offerings of thine hand. This is talking about tithes and offerings. This would be the first tithe. There's 2 tithes in the book of Deuteronomy, first tithe and second tithe. The first tithe was to go down to where the sanctuary was. Now they could eat some of their corn and some of their products down there at the sanctuary, because it was to help them provide food for anybody that came to those feast days. And so they could eat it down there, but they were not to eat it in their home. Now the second tithe is different. They could eat that at home, but not the first tithe. But thou must eat them before the Lord thy God in the place which the Lord thy God shall choose. Thou and thy son, and thy daughter, and thy manservant, and thy maidservant, and the Levite that is within thy gates, and thou shalt rejoice before the Lord thy God in all that thou puttest thine hands unto. So it's basically saying, your whole family, even your servants, everyone is to go down there and celebrate the wonderful goodness of God there at the sanctuary. And of course they were to read the Word of God and so on. It was a very important educational event for them and to keep them connected to God. Verse 19 gives an important warning. It says, take heed to thyself that thou forsake not the Levite as long as thou livest upon the earth. Now, as you know, the priests came from the Levite tribe, and all of the workers in the sanctuary. And apparently later on, I don't know how early they started this practice, they had singers, they had musicians, they were all part to be paid by the tithe and to be taken care of carefully so that they had their services and they could make the services, the religious services, very inviting and very enjoyable. And this was a warning that they didn't listen to very well. As you know, in the book of Nehemiah, they had forgotten this requirement. In the book Education, page 148 and 9, it says, the appointed ministers of the sanctuary, the Levites, received no landed inheritance. In other words, no farm. They didn't get a farm. They were given cities to live in. They were given garden plots outside the city because they were to get exercise doing gardening. But they did not have a farm. They dwelt together in cities set apart for their use and received their support from the tithes and the gifts and offerings devoted to God's service. They were the teachers of the people, guests at all their festivities, and everywhere honored as servants and representatives of God. I don't think that happened a lot, but that's what was supposed to happen. Whenever they had a gathering, a Levite was to teach them something. It was, to have a spiritual dimension. If we can't have a spiritual dimension, probably we're doing things we ought not to be doing. Many parties, you wouldn't have any spiritual dimension because the kind of things people want to do at the party, they recognize it wouldn't fit, to have this. And so all their gatherings, whatever purpose they were to be, have a spiritual dimension, and the Levites were to be welcome always. To the whole nation was given the command, take heed to thyself, that thou forsake not the Levite as long as thou livest upon the earth. Why? Levi hath no part nor inheritance with his brethren. The Lord is his inheritance. You probably remember in the book of Acts, they came to the point where they needed some deacons. And the apostles indicated that their work was to be devoted to spiritual things, to studying the Bible, to prayer, to presenting truth to others, and so on. So that system existed in a different form in the Old Testament as well. And they were to have time so that they could be strong spiritually and help Israel to stay strong spiritually. Now, the sad part is that many of the Levites were not strong spiritually, and they couldn't benefit Israel. And today, many pastors are the same, and they don't strengthen people. But if the whole plan is followed, it's a great blessing that we have people that have time to really shed a strong spiritual impact over the lives of others. Verse 20 in Deuteronomy 12. When the Lord thy God shall enlarge thy border, as he hath promised thee, and thou shalt say, I will eat flesh, because thy soul longeth to eat flesh. Thou mayest eat flesh, whatsoever thy soul lusteth after. Now that is in the setting of clean meats, of course, because otherwise it would conflict with the rules about meat eating. And so people are not right when they twist that one. Also, this verse makes it clear. God is not saying, eat meat. He's saying, when you say you want to eat meat, okay, you can eat it. Evangelism 664 says, not till after the flood was man given permission to eat the flesh of animals. Why then need we eat flesh meat? Few who eat this know how full it is of disease. Flesh meat never was the best food, and now it is cursed by disease. So we have many, many reasons why it's bad practice to consider that the Bible approves of eating meat. We're not going to get it in heaven. Can you imagine somebody getting to heaven, which I don't think they will, and they're wishing they could get a piece of meat to eat? It's just not going to happen. God is going to clean up eating habits before people get to heaven. In verse 21, it says, if the place which the Lord thy God hath chosen to put his name there be too far from thee, then thou shalt kill of thy herd and of thy flock which the Lord hath given thee, as I have commanded thee, and thou shalt eat in thy gates whatsoever thy soul lusteth after. So he does give permission if the sanctuary is too far and they're not able to travel there. Even as the roebuck and the hart is eaten, notice again, both clean animals, so thou shalt eat them, the unclean and the clean shall eat of them alike, meaning ceremonially, the clean and the unclean. Only be sure that thou eat not the blood, for the blood is the life. And thou mayest not eat the life with the flesh. Thou shalt not eat it, thou shalt pour it upon the earth as water. Thou shalt not eat it, that it may go well with thee, and with thy children after thee, when thou shalt do that which is right in the sight of the Lord. Now here, I believe, is the best counsel we can get. Thou shalt do that which is right in the sight of the Lord. Not what is right in our own eyes. Remember, we had that text earlier, that we should not do what every man thought was right in his own eyes, but what God tells us is right. So if he doesn't command it, which he never commanded the use of meat, even after the flood he gave them permission to eat it, but he didn't command that they eat it. And everything, if we are really wanting to follow God's will, then we're going to do not what he, where he gave permission to do it, but whether he really thinks it's a good thing for us to do. Only thy holy things which thou hast, and thy vows thou shalt take, and go unto the place which the Lord shall choose. So, if they had animals and they lived close enough, they would take those animals down. But he said, if you're too far away, you don't have to do that. Just take your, the money and whatever else you're going to give down there. And thou shalt offer thy burnt offerings, the flesh and the blood, upon the altar of the Lord thy God. And the blood of thy sacrifices shall be poured out upon the altar of the Lord thy God, and thou shalt eat the flesh. So that's, of course, talking about what they do at the sanctuary.
So was it the idea that they would take money to replace that which they ate and then be sacrificed?
Yeah.
And perhaps buy another offering?
You're right.
Sacrifice there in Jerusalem.
Right, we see that in Jesus' time, how they were buying animals at the sanctuary, and so if they were too far away, they were given permission to do that. Well, we'll stop there for tonight and pick it up next Friday night.